Chapter 33. Alva Connects the Dots. Jack dreamed he walked on ice. He dreamed he was sitting in the hull of a rowing boat, cold water up to his hips. Only the water outside the boat, the whole sea around him, was frozen. He dreamed he stood and looked down at his boots, watching himself take a step forward. He dreamed his hands shook. He woke up with a silent jolt. He was in the hut on Alva's island. The room was dark, and all he could hear was his own frantic heartbeat and, eventually, the even sounds of breathing. He turned around to see Jamie and Hiccup both curled up on their furs. Toothless lay on his stomach, the green of his eyes barely visible through the crack between his eyelids. He watched Jack without making any noise. Babytooth was nowhere to be seen. His body moved on its own, as if it knew where it was going before Jack did. He held back a groan as he stood, his body aching all over. His staff lay beside him, and he grabbed it, then had to lean heavily on it when his vision blackened for a moment. He felt so weak. His trek to the front door was a slow one, carefully trying each floorboard before stepping on it as to avoid any creaking. He was afraid Toothless would follow, but the dragon remained by Hiccup's side, as if he was guarding him. Part of Jack wanted to check on him first, check on both him and Jamie, but he couldn't. Not yet. He closed the front door as softly as he could, then slowly faced the ocean. It glinted back at him in the moonlight, calm and almost unmoving. Almost, but still definitely moving. He started walking towards the docks, but Babytooth's chirping nearly made his soul leave his body. "Gods, Babytooth, you—" he sighed, bringing a hand to his chest. Babytooth tweeted apologetically, and Jack shook his head. "It's okay, you just scared me. Hey," he looked at her. Looked at the way she moved, if her wings still beat in the same invisible rhythm, and if all her feathers were still in place. She seemed normal, if not a bit worried, but that was also normal. "How long have I been asleep?" Babytooth held up one tiny finger. "A day?" She nodded. Jack tried swallowing, but his mouth was too dry. He nodded back, then headed for the shore. If Jack remembered correctly, there should be a rowing boat missing from the pier, and then there was the matter of how weak he felt. Almost weaker than when Pitch had thrown him down that crevice in Antarctica. But as he walked to the edge of the pier and looked out at the sea, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. That and Alva's island was devoid of snow. The thought that there had been a blizzard seemed impossible. Not impossible, just improbable. Could it have been a dream? Jack asked hopefully. He expected a chirp for an answer, but what he got instead made his heart skip a beat a second time. "It wasn't a dream." Jack sighed heavily. "Jamie," he said, turning around. He stood just a few meters away. His skin was deathly pale in the moonlight, but what scared Jack more was the dotting of tiny scratches all across his face. Jack felt the boards move sickeningly beneath him. He nearly stumbled in his hurry to get to him. "I'm okay, Jack," Jamie quickly said, his dry lips pulling up into a reassuring smile. "Just a bit scratched up. Nothing worse than you?" Jack found it hard to speak. He hadn't really believed it, but he had hoped that maybe, just this time, luck was on his side, and the nightmare on the fairy's island hadn't really happened. And if that hadn't really happened, then Jack's dream of ice would have been just that as well, a dream. Jamie's eyes flickered up to the top of Jack's head. His eyes widened in shock and shattered the last of that hope. "Jack, your hair!" Again, it was as if Jack's body moved on its own. For some reason he didn't want to find out why Jamie was surprised about his hair, even if he thought he already knew. He should be grateful. This was what he'd been wanting all along, wasn't it? This would make everything so much easier. But what he felt wasn't gratitude. It was dread. He leaned over the edge and peered at his reflection. For a moment, relief began soothing the tension in his shoulders. A distorted mirror image of himself stared back at him. Brown eyes, brown hair, and, like Jamie said, tiny red wounds all across his face. But then he saw it. A stark white stripe, starting from the crown of his head and down towards his forehead, peeking up like an arrow. Jack sat back heavily, bringing a hand to the stripe. His breath was shallow. "He was right," he murmured. "North was right. My powers. They're coming back." Jamie stared at him, his eyes shining with the hope Jack should, but didn't, feel. "So it was you," he whispered. "You froze the ocean. You stopped the storm." He let out a hoarse, incredulous laugh. "You saved us, Jack." Above Jamie's head, Babytooth watched Jack silently. Jack blinked several times, forcing his breath into a steady rhythm. What exactly happened back then? After the sea froze?" "You don't remember?" Jamie said, then frowned when Jack shrugged in a so-so motion.
Well, the sea was frozen, so we walked the rest of the way. Toothers found us halfway across, and once you'd gotten Hiccup onto his back, you passed out.
He was quiet for a moment, then added,
In retrospect, you did seem kinda out of it.
I still feel kind of out of it, Jack admitted. He stared at his staff instead of meeting Jamie's eyes.
I walked on the ice?
Jamie nodded. He was quiet for a bit more before saying in a tentative voice,
I don't think I've ever seen you so, well, scared, but you did it.
Jack glanced up when Jamie gently nudged his knee. There was a small smile on his face.
You saved us,
he said again. There was that, too, Jack supposed. But he hadn't needed to save them if he hadn't put them in danger in the first place. Jamie looked genuinely happy, and there was real glimmering hope in his eyes. Yet all Jack could see were the angry red lines on his face.
I'm so sorry, Jamie,
he said. Jamie's smile melted away. He scooted forward and wrapped his arms around Jack's shoulders, hugging him tightly. Jack hugged him back, letting out a ragged sigh of both relief and sorrow. Back in the rowing boat, he thought the embrace would be their last.
I'm sorry, too,
Jamie mumbled, his voice muffled against Jack's shoulder.
It wasn't your fault. I'm sorry.
Jack hugged him tighter. Neither of them said anything for a little while. They just clung to each other, relishing in the fact that they'd survived. When Jack eventually got his emotions under control, he leaned back just a little bit in order to motion for Babytooth to join in, laughing when she all but dived at him. Jamie sniffled as he pulled back, wiping a tear off his face. He smiled sheepishly before his brows furrowed, and he looked at Jack imploringly.
You're not happy about it, he said. Your power's returning.
It wasn't a question. Jack looked down.
It's not that I'm not happy,
he said, and grimaced when it felt like a lie. He didn't really want to explain it. It felt like speaking it into existence.
If this means that I'm turning back into a spirit, then Hiccup,
Jamie finished for him. Jack couldn't help but chuckle. He didn't try to deny it. They both knew it was true.
What I want most is to go home,
he reassured Jamie.
I just wish...
He trailed off and continued to stare at his hands.
Is it, though?
Jamie asked softly. Jack looked up, but Jamie was staring at the oceans.
What? What you want most?
Jamie made his eyes.
Is it to go home? Jamie, don't avoid the question again, please.
A million possible answers swam in Jack's head. Some of them were true, some of them were not. Some of them seemed to be the right choice, even if they were dishonest, and those were the ones Jack wanted to say most. The ones that would leave Jamie feeling safe and hopeful and happy. But Jamie was a smart kid. Jack replied with the only answer that was truly honest.
I don't know.
There was silence. Jack used the pause to try and sort out his emotions, but to no avail. He just shook his head and said again,
I don't know.
His voice barely there. He closed his eyes.
I'm sorry, Jamie. I feel like I've failed. Over and over I keep failing. You haven't failed,
Jamie protested. There was a tremor in his voice, and though he spoke quietly, there was vigor in those words. He reached out and took one of Jack's hands, squeezing it.
You haven't failed, Jack,
he repeated, louder this time.
And I know you feel like your only purpose is to protect me, but you're more than just a guardian, Jack. You're Jack Snowverland, too. And that's okay. I think it's okay.
His voice broke off and a new tear rolled down his cheek.
I want you to be happy, too. Jack Frost or not.
Jack knew his own eyes were shimmering as well. He smiled at Jamie and squeezed his hand in return.
Thank you,
he said, which seemed too little to say in response to the intense gratefulness he felt at Jamie's concern and all the love he felt for this little boy who changed his life one Easter night. He took a shaky breath and let it out in a long, deep sigh.
But you know I can't stay anyway. I will get you home, even if it's the last thing I do. But what if there's a way that I can go home by myself?
Jamie said, and shook his head when Jake opened his mouth to argue.
Just what if? You could stay behind.
I still know too much, Jack said.
But what you said by the lake that night, Jamie said. I know you thought about it too. How grown-ups tend to forget about magic. Maybe that would happen to you too. You could just live a normal life. Maybe...
Jamie's gaze faltered, like he wasn't sure if he should say the next part or not.
Maybe this was supposed to happen. Maybe this is your second chance.
Jack was silent.
And even if you didn't forget, you don't know that it would be bad to stay behind, Jamie continued. Maybe things in the future stay the same, because if we change anything, then that's the way things have always been, so we haven't actually changed time travel. You know what I mean? You can stay behind, Jack.
Jamie stared at him and almost felt like he was pleading.
If you had the choice, would you stay behind?
I can't answer that right now, Jack said, and he meant it. Whenever he tried weighing his options, his mind seemed to shut off. He wondered if it was because he was afraid of the answer. Would he give everything up? Jack Frost, the Guardians, Jamie, just to remain human with Hiccup and the others on Berg? To have a chance to grow old, never alone again. He couldn't deny that the thought was tempting, unbearably so. He shook his head. How is Hiccup? He asked instead. Jamie's shoulders sank, but he didn't try to press the matter.
Alva helped take care of him when we got back, he said. Surprisingly, she didn't ask a lot of questions. She seemed scared, but she helped clean her wounds and bandaged Hiccup's leg. He's been asleep the entire time.
There was a terrible cold inside Jack's chest. I want to see him, he said. He grabbed his staff and got to his feet, heading for the hut before he could change his mind. Just then, there was a splash in the water. Jack whirled around, scared Jamie had fallen in somehow the second he turned away. But Jamie had just stood to follow and was looking at the water as well.
What was that?
He asked. Jack shook his head. Fish? I don't know. He walked on. Jamie followed.
He's had a fever, too, he said. Alva's been in and out and checking on him.
Jamie, Jack said, coming to a stop in front of the hut. Alva, she could see me, right? Jamie blinked. He started to nod, but his brows twitched.
She could see you, but you didn't have that white stripe then, he said reluctantly. I'm sure it's fine, though. I mean, it's only a few strands.
Jack pressed his lips together and nodded. The cold in his chest worsened. They quietly tiptoed into the hut, and Jack slowly approached Hiccup, kneeling by his side. His hair was plastered with sweat against his forehead, and he had the same vicious little wounds as Jack and Jamie. As ferocious as those fairies had been, at least they seemed they had little power when the victims remained in control of their own minds. Jack shook his head at the memory, cursing himself at how stupid he had been. Hiccup's words had been sharply accurate. Jack's gullibility, no new bounds, obviously. He hadn't even eaten their food like Jamie had, and yet the thought of staying there truly seemed like a wonderful idea at the time. Like Jamie had so passionately pointed out, he'd been happy there. So impossibly happy. This was just a testament for how Jack apparently couldn't have nice things. Jamie settled down beside him. He sat still for a few seconds before he leaned his head on Jack's shoulder. Jack brought an arm around him.
He fought so hard to protect me, and all I did was try to run away, Jamie mumbled.
You were bewitched, Jack said. Even I wanted to stay. Jamie sighed.
I just wonder if you would have fought as hard if you hadn't said that you trusted him to protect me.
Jack couldn't stop the laugh. What are you saying? Of course he would, he said, sending Jamie an incredulous look. And Hiccup, when has he ever not done everything in his power to help?
I just feel like he would have followed you if he had the choice.
Jamie glanced up at Jack, then looked back at Hiccup again.
Not that I think he would have abandoned me or anything, just...
He was quiet for a few seconds.
He just cares a lot about you, is all.
Jack smiled. He cares about both of us. Jamie was quiet for another few seconds.
Yeah,
he then murmured,
but you especially.
It was a strange thing to argue, and Jack probably would have pondered more about it if Hiccup hadn't stirred just then, giving a weak moan. Jamie straightened his back, leaning closer to him. Jack couldn't find his voice.
Hiccup?
Jamie said. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, Hiccup's eyes fluttered open. At first, he looked unseeingly up at the ceiling. Then Toothless got to his feet and pressed his giant face into his line of vision, making a low, cooing noise. Hiccup's lips moved as if they wanted to say something, but then he just looked to the other side, squinting.
What?
He started in a voice so hoarse it was barely there. His eyes met Jack's.
What happened?
Jack was holding his breath. For the third time that day, his body moved on its own, this time to put a shaky hand on Hiccup's shoulder. When it didn't pass through him, a sigh that sounded way too close to a sob escaped him, and he moved the hand to Hiccup's cheek before losing all self-restraint. He leaned down and hugged him, the best he could while Hiccup was lying down. It took every ounce of his willpower not to burst into tears. He hadn't even realized how scared he'd been. The relief was overwhelming. Hiccup made a sort of choked noise.
"Jack,"
he whispered, and Jack could feel him put a confused hand on his back.
"What's wrong?"
It really had to seem like something was terribly wrong for a reaction like this. Jack pulled away and couldn't help the grin on his face. He shook his head.
"Nothing is wrong,"
he said. Bleary green eyes stared back at him, and Jack resisted the urge to hug him again.
"I was just worried, is all. Happy to see your eyes again. They're a very pretty green."
Hiccup kept staring at him. Jamie cleared his throat, and Jack realized he sounded like a madman. He found it in him to finally feel a little bashful about his behavior, and he quickly sat up straight.
"Sorry, I babble when I'm nervous. People just don't hear it."
Jack paused. Usually." Jamie stifled a laugh, and Jack elbowed him.
"Okay,"
Hiccup said slowly.
"What?"
Toothless had waited up until that moment to bombard Hiccup with dragon kisses, and Hiccup's voice croaked when he cried out in protest. Toothless went on to bound around the room, almost knocking over the lantern placed by the wall. Hiccup smiled tiredly and began to push himself up. He sent the blanket a strange look before removing it.
Good. Still got the one,"
he said, but then he frowned when he saw the bandages.
"Where's my prosthetic?"
"Threw it into the sea," Jack said, and shrugged when Hiccup raised his brow at him. "It was cursed or something. The fairies—" Hiccup only seemed to remember the fairies at that exact moment. His gaze went distant for a second before he lay heavily back down.
"Right,"
he said faintly.
"The fairies. That was a thing."
Jamie wrung his hands, so Jack reached over and squeezed them lightly.
"That was my last one,"
Hiccup murmured. Jack grimaced.
"Maybe you can make a new one here?"
he said. "They must have a forge, right?"
"Maybe it's a sign that it's time to go back."
Jack sent Jamie a surprised look. Jamie only glanced up at him and then looked away in shame.
"Just a break," he clarified. "Maybe we can go back to Burke for a little while, regroup and all that."
There was a long silence. Jack had a strong feeling this had something to do with what they talked about on the pier, like Jamie was actively trying to make Jack admit that he actually wanted to stay behind. But even more so, he thought it had to do with the fairies. It had been Jamie's closest encounter with death yet. He needed a break, Jack knew that. And going back to Burke, maybe that was the solution. Jack could leave Jamie there and keep him safe while he and Hiccup collected the rest of the crystals. That is, of course, if they got some guarantee the Snow Queen wouldn't attack Burke again. The door opened, and Jack whirled around at the sudden noise.
"Oh, you're awake,"
Alva said, her face breaking into a smile.
"That's good. I just finished cooking breakfast."
"Bad mushrooms," Jack said, at the same time as Jamie said,
"Food poisoning." "Pesky insects,"
Hiccup mumbled through the stew in his mouth. It was hard to swallow. Not because of the taste. The taste was way above Hiccup's standards, but despite his exhaustion, he didn't have much of an appetite. But Alva had cooked for them, so he sent her a polite smile.
"Just a bad experience overall."
Alva raised her brows at them. "You expect me to believe that, after what you told me?" Hiccup glanced at Jack, who just shrugged, then swallowed his food.
"I would expect that's easier to believe than that there's something magical there," he said. "What do you think happened?"
"Well," Alva said, setting her plate down in her lap, "most of us already had a suspicion there's something funny about that place. Be it wraith or some godly curse, we don't know, but something is not right. Then you come here, the first visitors in—" She trailed off, looking blankly at the wall. "Some time, and say you're looking for magic, and you have to go to the one sketchy place we've all agreed to stay far away from, for Thor's sake. You leave and the storm blows up almost immediately. Then Toothless suddenly runs out in the middle of it, and then he comes back with you, 2 of you unconscious, and all 3 of you," she gestures at them, "looking like that." Hiccup shifted uncomfortably under his blanket. He couldn't remember anything about a storm. At least he thought he couldn't remember it, though there had been a moment where it felt awfully cold, and it felt like some of that cold lingered, sending little shivers up Hiccup's spine. But the pictures in his head were too scrambled to make sense of. He must have been delirious.
"So yeah, I think it's safe to say something weird is going on," Alva finished. "And this is my island, and I'm going to be chief of this tribe one day, so I—"
She hesitated, but then tilted her chin up and finished firmly.
"So I demand that you tell me what's going on."
Hiccup, Jack, and Jamie were all silent. Hiccup felt bad. It wasn't easy to be the heir, especially when you weren't all that good with acting authoritative.
Alva,
he said, leveling her with a serious look.
This is information that might be a lot for you to carry, especially as the daughter of the chief. You'll have to decide what's best for your tribe, whether you want to share this with them or not. If you can trust them not to be hysterical, or if you can trust yourself to bear the secret on your own.
Jack sent him a look that seemed somewhat impressed, and a bit concerned, as if Hiccup had said something weird. Alva, meanwhile, had a gleam in her eyes.
So it's true, she said. There is magic there.
Hiccup glanced at Jack before nodding.
Yes, something other than wraiths, but just as dangerous, he said. Maybe even more dangerous.
Alva stirred her stew absent-mindedly.
Do you know what happened to my grandfather and his crew?
Jack lowered his gaze and nodded. They were killed by the fairies, he said, not making any attempt to sugarcoat it. I can't say for sure, but I imagine they tricked your grandfather into eating their food. They get into your mind and... He glanced at Jamie, then sighed. Just trust us when we say you shouldn't attempt to fight them. There are too many, and we barely made it out alive. Alva's mouth hung open and she stared at Jack.
Fairies? Fairies?
Gods, she breathed, pushing her hair out of her face.
Oh, this is a lot. It all makes sense.
It wasn't what Hiccup expected her to say.
Really?
Alva shrugged feebly.
Sort of, she said. The island of the wraiths, though I suppose I should stop calling it that, wasn't always there. Well, that's what I've heard, at least. But it was long before I was born. If, of course, it even happened. But the story is this. Once upon a time, our ancestors sailed to this island and set up camp. They didn't intend to stay long, but they just needed a place to rest and gather new resources for the journey ahead. But then one night, a guard patrolling the shore noticed a thick fog creeping its way along the horizon.
Her voice took on a haunting tone. Both Jack and Jamie sat very still, already enraptured by what might be a fairy tale or, most likely, something more. Even Baby Two sat atop Jack's head, with her tiny mouth ajar in suspense. As he watched, the fog came closer, forming itself into the shifting form of a mountain. And then, when the fog dispersed, an island stood in its place. Everyone was sure there had been no island there before, and so people began to fear it. They decided this place was not safe, it was cursed, or it was haunted. They believed the island might be the entrance to the underworld itself.
Hiccup swallowed thickly. So, the tribe prepared the ships in a hurry and they set sail. They sailed until the sun was high in the sky, and at last they spotted land again. They saw the island was inhabited because there were huts there. But there was something awfully familiar about those huts.
Jamie brought his hands to his mouth.
They'd sailed back to the island, he whispered.
Alva nodded.
They tried to turn around, and they sailed for a long time again. But the same thing happened. No matter how long they sailed, no matter if they followed the stars or the path of living things in the sky, they always ended up right here on this island. Legend says that, ever since then, nobody has found their way off these waters.
Alva looked down at her hands for a moment, her brows furrowed. Then she smiled and looked up again.
But, as you mentioned, it's just a legend. Nobody knows if it's true.
Hiccup held back a sigh, rubbing his forehead. He was getting awfully tired of knowing that he'd never hear the word legend again without thinking there was too much truth in it for comfort. He was getting awfully tired in general, as if Alva had put something in his stew. What a thought. Had he always been this paranoid?
You think it's true? Jack asked. The fairies somehow created that island and trapped you here?
Alva smiled, a little uneasily.
I don't know, she said. We've lived here my entire life, and I have no need to see the world. This is my world. I think the rest of the tribe agrees. It's not that we can't get away, it's just that we want to stay. What? Hiccup said. You can't mean that.
The words had come out on their own accord, like Hiccup hadn't even thought them before they were out. There was just something about Alva's resignation about the whole thing. If they really were being held here by the fairies, they had to fight back, somehow. Alva tilted her head to the side.
Can't a girl be content with what she has? She asked. But you haven't even seen dragons before, Hiccup argued.
He put a hand on Toothless's head, who was resting beside him.
This island, I'm sure it's a great place, but it can't keep you content forever, can it? There's a whole world out there. I'm going to be chief one day.
Alva said simply.
My place is here.
I'm going to be chief one day, Hiccup countered. But my father couldn't have stopped me from seeing the world even if he tried. And he's tried. But in the end, he's an adventurer too. He wants to see the world as much as the rest of us. There's breathtaking islands, incredible dragons, and, as I've discovered lately, also magic. Though you might want to be careful with that last one.
He paused, and a small laugh escaped him.
Dragons as well, to be fair.
Jack was giving him a purely concerned look now, if not for the usual side of mild amusement. Hiccup, are you feeling okay? It was a very good question. Hiccup was starting to feel like he was back on that rowing boat, the floorboards moving imperceptibly beneath him. He had a slow realization that he'd been acting a bit more enthusiastic than was probably expected of him in this situation.
What? I'm allowed to be excited about stuff, aren't I?
He still asked, a tad defensively. Of course you are, Jack said with a laugh. Then he swiftly reached over and pressed a hand against his forehead. He grimaced. You just look a bit tired, is all.
Alva, could you fetch some water?
Alva reached over and collected their empty bowls, smiling amusedly at Hiccup.
Coming from a seasoned adventurer such as you, I might take your word for it, she said. I'll be right back.
Hiccup watched her leave, then turned to Jack with a frown.
Am I acting weird?
A bit, Jack admitted, studying him. Jack's hair was tousled, and he had circles under his eyes as always, but he didn't seem nearly as exhausted as Hiccup felt. Your fever seems to be getting worse.
Though, Jack hesitated. Jamie, could you feel his temperature?
Jamie sent Jack a frown before realization dawned on his face.
Oh, no, I think...
He put a hand on Jack's hand, then sent him an encouraging smile.
Don't worry, your hands are warm.
Which was one of the weirder exchanges Hiccup had seen between them. Maybe he really was getting delirious again. Lie down, Hiccup, Jack said. Hiccup deadpanned.
Are you going to try to nurse me back to health? I feel fine.
I said that one time I was sick too, and then I passed out, Jack said.
Yes, but you have a history of passing out. It takes a little more for a strong, burly Viking like me to lose consciousness.
Jack laughed in a way that did not do wonders for Hiccup's confidence. It still made him smile. Instead of lying down, he brought the blanket tighter around himself and leaned up against the wall.
Anyway,
Hiccup said,
while Alva's gone, I would like to know what exactly happened after I...
Passed out, Jack said helpfully. His eyes were crinkled with mirth, but then his smile slowly melted. We escaped the fairies and rowed back, but the storm almost made us capsize. Toothless saved us. Hiccup closed his eyes.
That must have been awful, he mumbled. I'm sorry,
No, don't do that, Jack said, waving his hand. No guilt. You did your best and you saved Jamie.
He did call the fairies glorified insects, though,
Jamie said, then smiled when Hiccup sent him a glower.
It was awesome, but it did make them pretty angry.
Jack laughed again, grinning at Hiccup. You hooligans are so rude, he said.
It's part of our culture,
Hiccup said with a shrug.
What about the crystal?
Jack sighed. It's not working, he said. I hoped that just being in the valley had energized it, but I've tried. This counts as a first utter failure.
Hey,
Hiccup said. He wanted to reach out and pat Jack's shoulder, or give him a hug, rather, but he was too far away, and Hiccup didn't have enough energy to move. But he smiled encouragingly.
That's not too bad. We've been through a lot, and this is just our first. That's pretty impressive, I'd say.
Both Jack and Jamie's expressions brightened.
It's just,
Hiccup said, looking down at his hands. He tried recalling the images from the day before. He remembered clutching his leg, then Jack coming to his rescue. He remembered that it was painful, but it felt too far away to properly recall the feeling. After that, things were hazy, but...
It's strange. I thought the Snow Queen attacked us in the midst of it. I guess I was just panicking and expecting the worst to happen. I don't remember the storm, but I have this weird memory of just ice. Lots of ice.
He shook his head. Jack was quiet for a moment. He shook his head too. She wasn't there, he said. He brushed a hand through his hair, pulling lightly at the strands in a motion that Hiccup couldn't remember seeing him do before. It wasn't one of his usual tics. And nothing is, Jack continued, clearly trying to sound nonchalant but failing. I mean, nothing's out of the ordinary, right? Hiccup raised a brow. He sent Jamie a look, but Jamie was looking pointedly at Jack. He could ask if he'd cut his hair, but that was obviously not it.
No? Do you think anything is out of the ordinary?
He asked back. Maybe it had something to do with Jack's strange behavior when Hiccup had woken up. Honestly, it wasn't the first near-death experience. Jack should be used to it by now. That being said, Hiccup's soul had just been about to leave his body when Jack had looked at him like that, and then complimented his eyes. Bastard. Jack's eyebrows twitched.
No,
he said, the corners of his lips quirking upwards.
I hope not.
It was just a very close call, is all. Come to think of it, Hiccup. His eyes moved down Hiccup's blanket, his brows furrowing. Could I examine your leg? Hiccup didn't like his tone. That, and Jack had mentioned the fairies cursing his prosthetic or something. Hiccup remembered their voices, penetrating his mind, cursing him, calling him a boy of iron. He pulled up his blanket, holding back a sigh at the sight of his prosthetic-less leg. It was wrapped in bandages, which he'd been informed was Alva's doing. He started unwrapping them.
Pretty miraculous that we all made it out of that alive,
Hiccup heard himself saying, which, in retrospect, felt like the worst thing to say in that moment. He blamed his fever. The last of the bandage fell to the floor, and the first thing he registered was the aggressive red around the stump of his leg. Then he saw something else. Thin, moss-green veins creeping up his shin. Jack's face was stony. He put a hand under Hiccup's shin, the gentle touch sending a faint jolt through the rest of his body.
What is it?
Hiccup asked, not sure if he wanted to know the answer. Jack's jaw clenched. I don't know, he murmured and pressed his lips together. He set Hiccup's leg down, then sent Hiccup a look that was so unnaturally calm it went right back to panicked. But there's probably a way to fix it. Don't worry, Al. The door opened again, and Jack pulled the blanket over Hiccup's legs.
I brought some tea,
Alva announced cheerfully.
And water, as you ask, of course, but the tea might help even more.
Jamie grimaced.
Herbal tea?
The best kind, Alva promised, and Jamie sent Hiccup a weirdly empathetic look. Despite Alva's herbal tea, Jamie was sad, but not surprised to see that Hiccup's fever only got worse. It hadn't helped Jamie when he was sick, and it wasn't helping Hiccup either. The next couple of days went by slowly, and Hiccup spent most of the time unconscious, and all of it sweating and shivering. Toothless stayed loyally by his side, curled around him to give Hiccup as much heat as possible. And when Hiccup was unconscious, Jack spent most of the time sitting close by, watching over him and making sure he was hydrated. Alva didn't ask too many questions. She was clearly curious, but she seemed to understand that the three of them were all very tired and very scared. Her questions could wait. Instead, she prepared meals for them, made sure they were warm and comfortable, and did her best at shooing off nosy villagers. And Jamie didn't know what he could do to help, so a lot of the time he just watched and felt increasingly worse about himself. It was sunset on the second day when Jack asked if Jamie could look after sleeping Hiccup so that he could take a little walk. Jamie obliged, and couldn't help but notice the hard expression on Jack's face as he exited the hut, and the way his knuckles were wide around his staff. Jamie sat closer to Hiccup, sending a small smile to Toothless, whose tail was shifting restlessly. He probably missed flying, but he refused to move from Hiccup, even when Hiccup himself said he could go flying with Jamie. Close to the ground, of course, if he needed to burn some energy. But Toothless stayed, and now Hiccup was curled up in a cocoon against his chest. Jamie brought his knees up to his chest, letting out a deep sigh.
I'm sorry,
he mumbled, even if Hiccup couldn't hear him. He'd probably just say it wasn't Jamie's fault anyway.
It's not your fault.
Jamie straightened in surprise.
I thought you were sleeping,
he said, then frowned.
Did you read my mind?
Hiccup's dry lips curled into a weak smile.
I was. Guess you woke me,
he said. His voice was terribly hoarse. Toothless made a soft whining noise, and Hiccup patted his paw comfortingly.
Cheer up, you big baby. No, I wasn't reading your mind, Jamie. But your expression is pretty easy to read. You and Jack, you were the same one.
Jamie didn't know what to say to that.
Water?
He offered. Hiccup shakily pushed himself up and accepted the cup. He took small sips and grimaced when he swallowed. Seconds passed by without anyone saying anything.
Where's Jack?
Hiccup then asked.
He just went out, Jamie said. He asked me to look after you.
It's not like I'm gonna randomly burst into flames if no one's watching or whatever,
Hiccup mumbled.
It's just a fever.
But he didn't sound entirely convinced. The green veins in his legs were bad news, and they all knew it.
Jack will figure it out,
Jamie said. Hiccup's smile was soft.
You believe a lot in him.
He deserves to be believed in,
Jamie replied with a half-hearted smile of his own.
I just wish I'd been stronger back then. I shouldn't have eaten that strawberry, and
he held up a hand when Hiccup opened his mouth.
I know that you and Jack will just say that they were controlling our minds or whatever, but it still feels bad.
Hiccup was quiet, but there was nothing about him that made Jamie feel he held any sort of resentment from what had happened. Jamie supposed that when the apologies and reassurances were all said and done, there wasn't much else to say.
Thank you for not letting me run back in there, though,
Jamie mumbled. Hiccup remained quiet for a few seconds more.
You're very brave, Jamie,
he said.
Incredibly so. Thornose and I wouldn't have been able to do all that you've done at the age of 11.
Jamie raised a brow.
Says the guy who defeated a Titan-winged dragon at 15.
I had help,
Hiccup pointed out with an amused smile.
But that's not the point. What I'm saying is that you can't always walk forward. It's like I said earlier, we've been making progress for so long, some setbacks are inevitable. But whenever we take a step backwards, we then take 2 steps forward. This,
he gestured at his legs,
was a risk I chose to take when I joined you. It could have happened to any of us, and in thousands of other ways. Besides, my dad always says,
he made a face while imitating Stoic's deep voice and accent,
we are Vikings. It's an occupational hazard.
Just then, there was a knock on the door, and Alva peeked inside.
Hi there, she said. Brought firewood. Is everything all right?
Jamie met Hiccup's eyes again and smiled gratefully.
I think so,
he said.
Good, good,
Alva said, walking up to the hearth.
Just thought you should know. Jack is at the pier doing... Well, I'm not sure what it is he's doing. It looks a bit ritualistic. I decided not to approach. Not because I was scared or anything, he just looked very busy.
You should probably check on him instead of me,
Hiccup mumbled.
Then you should watch over Hiccup, Alva,
Jamie said, getting to his feet. He sent Hiccup a grin.
Make sure he doesn't randomly burst into flames.
Alva looked confused, but she nodded cheerfully, and Jamie exited the hut. He turned left and headed for the pier, where, sure enough, Jack was standing, holding his staff and swinging it idly at the water. As Jamie approached him, Jack crouched down and reached out with his hand, his fingertips tapping against the surface. Jamie realized what he was doing.
Maybe you shouldn't try that in broad daylight,
he suggested as he stepped onto the pier. Jack turned his head to him, but didn't move his hand. It's sunset, he replied. He sent the water a disappointed glower.
Besides, it's not working.
Jamie sat down beside him. He glanced around, making sure nobody was watching.
Why are you doing this now?
He asked.
What do you mean? If it happened once already, my powers must already be there,
Jack said, frowning at the water.
They just won't come out.
He sounded deeply frustrated. Jamie looked at the water too, waiting. Nothing happened.
How does it feel?
He asked. Jack sent him a confused look, and Jamie nodded at the staff.
To do magic. Maybe you should try to replicate the feeling.
Jack looked into the air, pursing his lips. It feels... he started slowly. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, and shook his head. It feels just like having arms. Jamie frowned. You know, it just feels like doing anything, Jack said. He sighed a laugh and gestured helplessly with his hands. A lot of the time I wasn't completely in control of it, like a subconscious thing, like breathing. I've never even had to focus on it before, and now... Jamie nodded slowly.
Like what happened? You didn't mean to freeze the sea, but...
Yeah, Jack murmured. I have frozen a bunch of stuff on accident before, like an emotional response, so I guess it makes sense. Shaking the water off his hand, Jack straightened and looked up at the darkening sky. His face was hard to read. Hiccup doesn't see the white, he said.
Seems that way, Jamie agreed. But that's a good thing, isn't it? Seems to me you're not planning on revealing anything to him anytime soon.
Jack grimaced. No, it would scare him anyway, I'm sure, he said with an unhappy chuckle. He hasn't had a single nice experience with magic. I'd rather just appreciate the time with him that I have left before we leave or I disappear.
Tell him then, Jamie said, grabbing Jack's arm to make him look back at him. Tell him about Jack Frost, and you won't disappear.
It took a few seconds before Jack replied. I don't know if I want him to see me like that, he admitted quietly. The looks the twins gave me sometimes, He closed his eyes and shook his head. If Hiccup looked at me like that...
He won't, Jamie said. Jack, Hiccup he's your friend. He trusts you, ex-spirit or not. I know he does.
Jack tilted his head to the side. You sound so certain, he said. Has he said anything? You have no idea, Jamie wanted to say, but he kept his mouth shut and looked down at the water again.
I just know. Hiccup
He didn't get any further because just then he thought he saw something in the water. No, not something. Someone. A face, looking back up at him from beneath the surface. His fear must have shown on his face because Jack quickly grabbed his staff and put his other arm across Jamie's chest as he looked over the edge of the pier. But the face disappeared into ripples so smoothly Jamie wasn't sure if he'd seen anything at all. What is it? Jack asked. Jamie started, his voice coming out as a squeak. He cleared his throat.
I'm not sure. I think I'm just hallucinating. I thought I saw a face.
Jack looked back at the water and sighed deeply. I don't have the energy for that right now, he said, and got to his feet. He smiled at Jamie and held out a hand. Come on, let's take a walk around the village instead. Jack woke up early the next day. He hoped to take a walk before the village woke up, because when he'd walked with Jamie the day before, it became clear that these people had not been taught that it's rude to stare. He checked if Jamie and Hiccup were still asleep, and managed to get out the door when Babytooth noticed him. He motioned for her to be quiet, and the two of them slipped out of the hut and into the dark, early morning. Credit where credit was due, this village was a lot more laid back when it came to visitors and Burkians. The night patrol spotted Jack as he made his way up the village, crossing the main square, but didn't try to stop him or question him. They did follow him with his eyes, and Jack didn't doubt they were actually paying closer attention than what it seemed, but he could appreciate that they did at least try to make it seem like they trusted him. He headed up towards the grassy hills where there'd been a rockfall from the mountains. It wasn't too far away from the village for it to be unsafe, but far enough away that people wouldn't see what Jack was doing. Obviously, the pier hadn't been of any help. Babytooth fluttered around Jack, chirping questions as he climbed on top of a boulder, but he didn't answer any of them. She would most certainly try to stop him if he did. All right, Jack said, standing tall on top of the boulder. What I need is a sense of urgency, an emotional response. Babytooth stared at him, then at the ground beneath him. She started chirping fiercely. I know I've tried this before, but now I know my powers are returning, Jack hissed back. And I'm not jumping from a cliff this time, am I? It's just a rock. The worst that can happen is a broken ankle. Babytooth did not seem reassured. Jack took a deep breath and closed his eyes. I just need to feel it, he said. This time, for sure, it will work. Because I've done it once already. Well, maybe not exactly this. Is flying not a part of the deal yet? He paused, looking up. Wind? You there? Hello? Hello? Jack nearly fell off the boulder in surprise. The wind had responded in many ways before, but actual words had never been one of them. But it wasn't the wind. It was Alva. Where did you come from? Jack asked, trying to gloss over the fact that he'd almost screamed. Alva frowned up at him. The village? She replied. Who are you talking to? Jack glanced at Babytooth. He gestured vaguely. The wind? Okay, fair enough, Alva said, smiling uncertainly. Oh, I didn't mean to follow you, by the way. I couldn't sleep and I saw you and, well, I guess I did follow you. Sorry. No worries, Jack said, though he had a few worries. He felt awkward standing atop the boulder talking to her, so he swiftly climbed back down, to Babytooth's relief. How much of that did you hear, exactly? Alva shifted her weight. Probably more than you'd like, I would guess, she said. She smiled apologetically and waved her hands. Don't worry. I already knew there's something weird about you guys. The fact that you might be magic isn't that surprising, all things considered. Oh, Jack said. That's good. I mean, that you aren't freaking out or anything. I'm not magic, though. No? Alva said. Okay, then. Jack squinted at her. And Hiccup and Jamie aren't either, he told her. Alva nodded. There was silence. I used to be, though, Jack mumbled in defeat. Alva looked at him for a few seconds before she nodded up at the hill. "Want to walk with me?" she asked. "You seem like you have a lot on your mind." A part of Jack wanted to decline the offer. He'd come out here this early for the sake of being alone, so that he could try practicing his powers uninterrupted. But Baby Tooth was already here, and now his secret was out to Alva anyway. He smiled wearily. "A walk sounds nice." Alva led him up the hill, which turned steeper the higher they got. They were both out of breath once they reached the top, but the reward was a charming view of the island. Jack could see patches of forests, ponds, paths to lonely huts, some from which smoke was rising. Baby Tooth made an appreciative sound from where she rested atop Jack's head. They walked along the ridge. The wind seemed fresher up here, and with a clear sky, the stars shone down on them from all around. "Do you struggle with sleeping a lot?" Jack asked. "Not really," Alva admitted. "It's been an eventful couple of days." "Sorry about that," Alva laughed. "You don't have to apologize. I didn't say it was a bad thing." They stopped at a point where their path started sloping downwards. The ocean stretched out in front of them. "It's just different. And with all the things on my mind just from listening to you, I can only imagine it's way worse for you guys." Jack studied her for a few seconds, noticing the way her gaze was fixed stiffly on the horizon. He held back a laugh. "You're curious," he said. "I'm practically dying to know more," Alva agreed, meeting his eyes with a bashful giggle. "I don't blame you for being quiet, though." Jack scoffed. "That's what Hiccup says, too, but I know he's lying," he murmured. Alva frowned. "You're keeping secrets from him?" she asked, surprised. "He knows most of it," Jack said, in a half-hearted attempt to defend himself, but it only made him feel worse. "He just doesn't know about me." Alva nodded slowly. Her lips quivered, opening and closing. "What? Sorry," she started, smiling sheepishly and shifting her weight from side to side. "This is probably a rude question. I'm sorry if it's rude. I swear I don't mean anything. Just ask." Jack laughed. "Well, what are you exactly?" Alva bit her lip and restlessly inched down the path. "I mean, not what, but, you... She gestured at him, caught Jack's amused smirk, and dragged a hand over her face. "Sorry, it's just... nothing ever happens here. This is the most exciting thing that's ever happened in my entire life." Jack walked up beside her. "I'm human," he replied simply. He watched the steps as they inched down the hill. "I was human, and then I was something else, and now I'm human again." "Something else?" Alva inquired. "A spirit." "Oh, I see." She paused and shook her head. "No, I don't see. Does that usually happen? Going human, spirit, I'm not a spirit again, though," Jack said, "though it kind of seems I'm on my way there. And no, it doesn't usually happen." Alva let out a shaky breath. "That's amazing," she said. You think you're turning back into a spirit? Was that what you were talking about back there?" Jack nodded. He hesitated, then said, "I think I stopped the blizzard. I think I might have started it too," he said, thinking back to the sudden gust of wind that had chased the fairies away when he'd saved Baby Tooth. There had been clouds on the horizon when they entered the forest, but they'd only looked like rain clouds. He regretted saying anything about that when he caught Alva's shocked expression. "You created a storm?" she whispered. Jack shrugged uncomfortably. "It's sort of my whole thing," he mumbled without meeting her eyes. "But no, I can't do anything. Maybe I spent my whole magic quota to save us, or whatever. It was enough to knock me out." The path crept into a small forest, blocking out the stars. "Why haven't you told Hiccup about this?" Alva asked tentatively. "What is it you're after, exactly?" "A way home," Jack replied, debating whether or not he wanted to ignore the first question. "To my... realm." Alva frowned at him before her eyes went wide. "Wait, you're not... realm? Do you mean..." She brought a hand to her mouth. "Blizzard, are you like... Scotty?" Jack blinked. "Who?" "I thought Scotty was a girl, though," Alva mumbled, shaking her head. "But you're from another realm, and you can create blizzards." "Oh, gods! Are you a god?" "No," Jack said, taking a step back as if to physically distance himself from that notion. "I'm not a god, and I have no idea who Scotty is. I'm just a guy, a normal guy, more or less." "Oh," Alva said, clearly relieved. "Because if you were a god, it would have made sense that you haven't told Hiccup.
The gods always disguise themselves in the stories.
I'm just worried he won't take it well, Jack said.
Besides, I don't even know if what happened was a one-time thing. It certainly seems that way right now. He made a flowing gesture with his hand, waiting for snowflakes to form around it. Still, no success. If my powers are gone, there's no need to tell him. Shame. I would have loved to see some magic, Alva said. She smiled at Jack. Maybe Hiccup would too. You can't be sure, can you?
I'd like to be, Jack muttered.
I've gotten the impression you're a risk-taker, Alva said. Is that wrong?
They'd exited the forest and were now walking down towards the coastline. Sand mixed with the grass. The sky had turned a pale blue over the horizon. Jack looked down at his shoes. Risk-taking was what got us into this mess.
I see.
Alva folded her hands behind her back and looked up at the sky as they crossed the line between grass and sand. She was quiet for a few seconds, her expression pensive.
Obviously, I don't know any of you, but Hiccup...
Her lips quirked up into a coy smile.
Hiccup is clearly not unaccustomed to the unexpected. I mean, he has a dragon.
Jack huffed a laugh. You have a point there, he agreed, twirling his staff idly. You should hear the stories he's told me. Even for a Viking, he's done some crazy stuff.
Really?
Alva said, her eyes shining.
Well, there you go. Maybe you don't need to be scared. I mean, you could tell him that your true form is a gigantic monster with 5 heads and 20 legs, and he'd still find a way to deal with it.
You're saying if I was a scary beast with multiple heads and legs who, say, could shoot fire, Hiccup would still like me? Alva didn't know the extent of Hiccup's love for dragons, so she just scoffed.
I'm saying Hiccup is brave and heroic and kind and... She trailed off, glancing at Jack. I mean, I don't know him, so I can't say for sure. I sort of wish I did.
There was something about her eyes, thoughtful but not vacant, and very, very soft. It reminded Jack of the way Tooth sometimes looked at him. Alva reminded him a lot of Tooth in general. But Alva wasn't looking at Jack. She was looking at the horizon, talking about Hiccup. Jack frowned, looking down at his shoes again.
Yeah,
he said.
You're pretty spot on. I just can't help but wonder if he's right,
Alva murmured, as if she was mostly talking to herself.
Maybe it is kind of outrageous that I don't want to leave this place. You see, I was talking to Hiccup yesterday and he told me a little bit about that island, about the fairies. He said that he hadn't wanted to leave, that the fairies had made you believe you were happier with them. Did you feel that way too?
Jack wasn't sure why the thought of Hiccup sharing that with Alva irked him. He mentally shook the feeling away and nodded. We all felt that way. They were getting closer to the docks. Jack could just see the top of their burrowed hut. He wondered if Hiccup was awake.
And how, in the story, when the island appeared, the tribe tried to escape, but they couldn't, Alva continued. And then, when my grandpa came back from his expedition, wounded and driven mad, nobody thought that it might be a good idea to leave this place. And why I still didn't even think of leaving when I saw the state of you guys. Isn't that a bit strange?
Jack studied her face. Her voice had risen a little in pitch, and her brows were knitted, but she still seemed more pensive than worked up.
Are you saying you think the fairies have put a curse on this place?
He asked, and as he said it, he believed it too.
I don't know, Alva said. I just feel like I should be less calm about this than I am. Jack... She stopped walking and brought her hands to her chest, fiddling with her fingers. I don't know anything about the life you've been living, but there's a part of me that feels like you coming here is the start of something, and you have had powers that might be returning.
She looked up at him, a serious crease between her brows.
I'm not asking you to promise anything, but...
Jack realized what she was asking.
If there's a way to help, I'll try,
he heard himself saying. He looked at his frostless staff, gripping it tightly.
I can't promise anything, though. I don't know if my powers will return.
Alva smiled.
That's good enough, she said, then hugged Jack swiftly. Thank you. I should probably go back home and get you some breakfast.
Huck still baffled Jack a bit, but he managed a light laugh.
Thank you as well, he said, as they started walking again. And I guess this goes without saying, but I'd appreciate it if you kept a bit quiet about this. Until you tell Hiccup,
Alva said with a nod. Jack could only nod back, and when he did, Alva's brows furrowed, her eyes going up to the top of his head.
Did you always have that streak of white in your hair?
Jack couldn't help but grin, feeling a tiny burst of what he'd felt when Jamie had first seen him. He put a finger to his mouth in a hush motion. Realization dawned on Alva's face, and she beamed back. They stopped by the well and fetched water before going back to their hut. Jack carefully opened the door and peeked inside. Everyone was still asleep, including Toothless, who barely opened one eye at their entering before snoozing on. Alva poured the water into the crook by Hiccup's side before carefully reaching over and touching his forehead with the back of her fingers.
"He's still so warm," she murmured.
Jack walked up to her side and sat down, studying Hiccup's face. He sighed, trying to ignore the guilt he told both Hiccup and Jamie not to feel.
"He'll pull through," he whispered. "That's just what he does."
Alva looked at him before sitting as well.
"How long have you known each other?"
she asked. Couple of months or so," Jack said, then laughed quietly.
"It feels a lot longer." "I thought it would be longer," Alva said. "You seem like you've been through a lot together."
Jack smiled.
"I think, aside from Jamie, there's not anyone else I've been through more with. At least not this kind of adventure."
"Did he persuade you into seeing the world too?" Alva said with an amused grin.
"Oh, no, the adventure was going to happen anyway. He just refused to let us go alone,"
Jack explained, his smile widening at the memory of Hiccup's fierce declaration of friendship. He shook his head, looking down at his hands.
"He's that kind of stupid brave. To his credit, we probably wouldn't have lasted a day without him."
Alva hummed softly.
There were a few seconds of silence, and then she murmured, "He's kind of handsome, isn't he?"
Jack turned to her. He didn't know what to say to that, so he kept quiet. When Alva looked back at him, Jack didn't know what she saw in his expression, but it made her tilt her head questioningly to the side. And then her mouth fell open, her eyebrows shooting up to her hairline.
"Oh, I guess I should have asked if—"
she started uncertainly. Jack tilted his head to the side in the same fashion she had, and Alva smiled sheepishly.
"I just got a bit carried away. I didn't think... But you go well together. I can see that."
Jack stared at her.
"Yeah,"
he said slowly, completely lost on what had warranted this reaction.
"I guess so."
Alva was a bit red. She gave an exasperated chuckle, pushing hair out of her face.
"Well, don't worry. He's just intriguing," she said. "You seem happy together."
Jack felt his jaw go slack when he realized what Alva was implying.
"Oh,"
was all he managed to say in reply.
Is this a secret too?"
Alva then whispered, glancing at Jamie.
No?"
"Ah, good. Because my judgment was a bit clouded due to that little infatuation, but it's pretty obvious." Alva laughed again, then sighed.
"I do wish I could find someone to look at me with such adoration."
Jack was quiet. He nodded slowly.
"All the boys in the village are just not my type,"
Alva continued, and it was clear that she was just rambling now. She cleared her throat and got to her feet.
"Anyway, breakfast, yeah? See you in a bit."
She flashed a stiff grin, then hurried out of the hut. Jack stared at the door before slowly turning his gaze vacantly to the wall.
"What just happened?"
he whispered to himself. Baby Tooth chirped in reply, making Jack flinch. He'd forgotten she was there.
"I'm wondering the same thing."
Jack flinched again, harder this time. He stared at Hiccup, who was squinting at him under heavy eyelids.
"What? When did you wake up?"
he hissed. He was getting very tired of getting sneaked up on, though this wasn't technically sneaking. It still counted.
"When Alva was talking about boys,"
Hiccup mumbled. He rubbed his eyes, tried to sit up, but then let his head fall heavily onto the bearskin again.
"She seemed kind of worked up."
I don't know. Girls," Jack said with a shrug. Hiccup frowned at him.
"You okay?"
"Yeah, of course," Jack said, and he thought he was telling the truth. He just wondered why he hadn't been able to tell Alva she'd misunderstood. Another 3 days passed before Hiccup woke up in the middle of the day and declared that he was well enough to go on. He tried proving this by staggering to 1 foot, hopping out of the hut and getting Toothless to carry him down to the beach. Jack and Jamie hurried along. "You have a fever," Jack reminded him. Hiccup waved a dismissive hand.
"I'm tired of flying here all day," he said. "It doesn't seem like it's going to pass anytime soon, so we might as well leave."
Jack could all but hear Bunny's voice calling him a hypocrite when he argued,
"You're going to hurt yourself."
Hiccup sent him a doubtful look, as if that had never happened before.
"Look, you're the one who keeps saying you can't afford to be picky with your magic, no matter how creepy," he said. "We didn't get any magic from the fairies, so we're behind schedule."
"What schedule?"
Jamie asked. "Just the schedule."
Hiccup made to shift the gears on Toothless's tail fin, then sent his leg off peg like a disdainful glare.
I think you have to do the steering, Jamie.
Jack studied him for a few seconds. Hiccup's shoulders slumped, and Jack could tell it was not just because of his exhaustion. He took a deep breath. Okay, he said. Let's try to go back to Burke. Like you said, Jamie, we need to regather our strength. And Hiccup needs new legs. And to see his home again. Jack added internally, and knew that was the greater reason. Hiccup perked up hopefully, but still chewed his lip.
Is that safe, you think?
Probably not, Jack admitted. We'll just have to be vigilant. He walked up to Toothless and stroked him under his chin, grinning when Toothless's eyes dilated happily. He looked up at Hiccup and nodded. Let's go home.
Now you are leaving,
came Alva's voice. She was walking down the beach towards them, a slightly wistful smile on her face. Right?
It's time,
Hiccup said. He slid off Toothless and only stumbled a little.
But you've been of incredible help, Alva. Thank you so much.
He held out an arm to her. Alva stopped in front of him. She nodded and grabbed his forearm.
I'm happy to have met you four,
she said, letting her hand fall. She looked at Jack.
I hope to see you again someday.
Jack sent her a meaningful smile and nodded. Jamie climbed up on Toothless, grinning excitedly. He helped Hiccup up, and Jack climbed up in the back. Toothless unfolded his wings languidly, letting out a delighted growl at finally getting to use them again, before taking off in the sky, heading north. Jack's stomach surged. He'd missed this too. Hiccup seemed less enthusiastic than usual, and Jack awkwardly patted his shoulder. I'm sure Gothi has some miraculous remedy for this, he said.
Oh, good. That makes me feel a lot better,
Hiccup said. He was silent for a few seconds before he turned back and sent Jack a tired smile.
It does actually make me feel better. I've missed Burke.
Jack smiled back. I know you have. They flew for a long while without seeing anything but sea. Jack tried keeping a lookout for the island they'd come from, though he already thought it was weird that they hadn't been able to see it from Alva's island. Jamie was the first one to point out land a couple of hours later. They flew closer, and Jack felt his stomach drop.
Okay,
Hiccup said slowly.
I guess this means Alva's legend is true. Who is surprised?
He didn't sound surprised. Alva was waiting for them at the beach. She didn't seem too surprised either.
I hoped I was wrong,
she said when they landed. Jack dismounted Toothless, sending the outline of the fairies' island a glower. So that means you really are cursed, he concluded. The fairies are keeping you here. The fairies are keeping us here. Alva looked apologetic, as if it were her fault.
Let's look for the tunnel,
Jamie suggested, jumping off Toothless as well, and setting off towards the spot that emerged 6 days ago. Jack didn't have much hope that it was there, but they followed Jamie even so. As expected, the tunnel was nowhere to be found.
We have to defeat the fairies somehow, Hiccup muttered, closing his eyes. If we can wipe them out.
We're not going back there, Jack interrupted firmly. They're way too strong.
Then what do we do? Hiccup asked.
He didn't even sound angry, just desperate.
We can't stay here forever, and Alva and her people have been trapped here for too long already. We have to do something.
Jack clamped his hand around his staff. The fairies' weakness was the cold. He could have stopped them if he had his powers. If this was their only option, it should be enough to push his powers into motion. It had to be enough. Jamie made his eyes, and Jack knew he was thinking the same thing. You're right, Jack said, turning his eyes to the ocean. Everything has a weakness. We just need to find out how to... His voice got stuck in his throat. His eyes had met someone else's. Someone was watching them from the water, shoulder deep in it. At first, Jack thought they were human, but there was something so uncanny about their features it made his heart leap into his throat. Their mouth was just a little bit too wide, their eyes a little bit too far apart and bigger than a human's. Their hair was long, black and wet, with an almost greenish tinge to it, and, as Jack continued to stare, he realized their skin was glistening with fish scales. Hiccup followed Jack's gaze and gave a hopeless little moan.
No way.
What is it?
Alva asked, her eyes blankly searching the sea. She couldn't see the creature.
Mermaid, Jamie whispered. I knew it.
The mermaid, creature? Came closer, and Jack saw the tip of a fish's tail peek out of the water. They opened their mouth, and out of it came a weird clicking noise, unlike anything Jack had ever heard before. It pointed at Jack and motioned for him to come closer. Jack exchanged a quick look with Hiccup before warily approaching the creature. He stopped at the edge of the water, but when the creature didn't say anything more, he took one more step, letting the waves wash over his boots. The creature opened the mouth again.
You froze our sea.
Jack almost stepped back out. His heart felt like it had stopped, and he quickly looked back at Hiccup. But Hiccup just looked confused, like he hadn't heard anything but the clicking. Jack looked at the water and then at the sea creature.
I'm sorry, he stammered. It was an accident. You understand it?
Hiccup asked, but Jack ignored him. The creature shook their head.
That's not the reason why I seek to talk to you, they said. We can show you the way out of these waters. The fairies don't have any power in our kingdom under the ocean.
It was too good to be true.
What's the catch?
Jack asked slowly.
In return, we ask for your help.
They held out a hand to Jack.
Come.
Jack felt himself inch backwards.
No thanks.
The creature narrowed their weird eyes.
Very well. Remain trapped here forever.
They made her sink back into the water.
Wait!
Jack yelped. The creature turned back to him. There was an eerie smile on their face. Jack swallowed.
Can't we just negotiate up here?
He pleaded. The creature shot the fairy's eye a look.
Prying ears,
was all they said.
What is she saying?
Jamie asked, who had apparently settled with the theory that this was a mermaid.
What's going on?
Alva whispered, sounding frightened. Jack glanced back at them, but turned to the creature again.
I can't breathe underwater.
Jack, Hiccup warned.
I'll help you with that, the creature promised. Please, you are our only hope.
Jack couldn't begin to imagine what kind of help he could possibly offer to someone belonging to the world of his worst fear. But, despite the creature's strange features, he recognized the feelings in their face, desperation and a glimmer of hope. He already knew he couldn't refuse. He just didn't know how to take a step forward. He looked back at the others.
They need my help,
he said, helplessly. Hiccup stared incredulously back at him.
With what?
I don't know.
She won't say. She wants me to follow her into the water. She says she'll help me breathe.
Hiccup gave a laughing scoff before sending Jack a sharp look.
Don't tell me you want to do it,
he pleaded. Jack shrugged.
Want is a strong word, he said, but they'll help us get out of here if I do, so I will. It's a trick, Hiccup said.
The mermaid hissed at him.
You said we have to do something, Jack said. This is something. I take it back, Hiccup retorted.
Jack smiled.
Hey, he said, we've practiced for this moment. It's fate.
Hiccup looked increasingly more desperate. He shook his head.
The stories don't say nice things about mer people either, he said. Please, Jack. They'll drown you.
Jack felt his lip quiver, and he pressed them together.
Hopefully not,
he said in a thin voice before turning around.
Jack!
Hiccup yelled. He ran into the water, but before he could get even close, the water itself rose like a wall in front of him, pushing him away. He fell back on the sand. The mermaid said nothing, but her glower could kill. Hiccup stared right back at her.
If you hurt him,
he started.
I will return him to you,
the mermaid said, though Hiccup didn't look like he understood her. She held out her hand again, beckoning Jack forward. Jack swallowed. Ignoring Hiccup's protests, he started walking deeper into the ocean. His shoulders rose up to his ears. The water was freezing.
Don't think, he chanted internally. Don't think.
Shakily, he reached out to the mermaid. Her fingers slid over his palm, her skin slippery, then locked firmly around his hand.
Take a deep breath, she told him.
Then she yanked him beneath the surface. Jack cried out, but only bubbles emerged from his mouth. Above him, the sunlight waned as the mermaid dragged him down into the deep.